Well, South Africa is hosting a meeting of the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors at Cape Town's International Convention Centre this afternoon. Xolani Mbanjwa is there for Newzroom Afrika. And Xolani, good afternoon to you. Cyril Ramaphosa, the president, opening this first meeting just earlier this morning. How much of a shadow would you say, if anything, is the issue of US tariffs casting at that meeting?
Good afternoon, Michelle. It's quite an important one since the beginning of this G20 gathering of the deputy finance ministers and deputy central bank governors and the B20 on Monday. The issue of the tariffs from the US side has been front and center and what it is actually going to mean for the global south, the second term of US President Donald Trump. There's a lot going on. There are many side events that are taking place, but when it comes to how the investment community and the leaders that have been attending the delegations to the questions here, the main response has been South Africa. When it comes to the frosty relationship with the US, there must definitely be a measured response because you can't replace the United States as a trading partner as far as South Africa's trade and economy is concerned. There are many other events that are taking place. The Minister of Finance, Nokotongwana, just an hour ago addressed the Finance in Common Summit, the biggest gathering, Michelle, of the investment community that you will find in the world today. Those who invest in climate change and the devastating floods in KwaZulu-Natal, where many people have lost homes and at least 9 people have lost their lives, has also reached the discussions here as far as what we are gathered here for, to protect the most vulnerable, because climate change, such as flooding that we have seen in KwaZulu-Natal, is hurting the poorest and most vulnerable the most. But to tell us more about why the Kotongwana, the finance minister, was talking so much about the need for climate finance, I'm joined by JP Tia, who is the lead economist at the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. JP, thank you very much for your time. There are devastating floods in KwaZulu-Natal. 9 people have died, and this is why you have traveled all the way from Asia to come here to talk about climate finance. But people are wondering, how is all the money in the world going to save their communities, save their families from climate finance such as flooding? Make it make sense for us.
Thank you, Xolani, for the question. First of all, let me say how sorry I am to hear about the tragedies, the floods in KwaZulu-Natal. Not just South Africa. Remember, Pakistan faced devastating floods a few years ago, and so did Brazil. So the problem is really quite global in nature. Let me say something about climate finance and the 3 major impacts that I see. Number 1, by investing in sustainable infrastructure, we prevent the worst of climate change. We prevent the repeat of many of these tragedies from happening. So that's number 1. Number 2, with climate finance, we can invest in resilient infrastructure, local adaptation, stronger roads, better power lines, better hospitals, so that all these critical services remain in operation during this time of crisis where they are most needed. That is where resilient, sustainable infrastructure comes into play, and climate finance will play a part. Number 3, don't forget, climate finance is ultimately about development, sustainable development. If we have more sustainable development, we bring incomes, we uplift the lives of these rural communities. So if we do climate finance right, it is actually a triple win for the global community and the local community. I think it's a really meaningful thing to do. Let me say something about AIIB. So AIIB already has a 50% climate finance target. We exceeded that already. So it is very much in our commitment to make sure that a majority of our financing go into climate finance for mitigation, adaptation, all the things that I mentioned. right? However, I do believe that we can do a lot more for Africa. President Jin has come back to Africa many times. Many of us are deeply engaged in various parts of Africa. Hopefully, this will turn into various projects for AIB, and we continue to put some of the finances to help Africa. Africa is a special place.
That is quite interesting. So what we are talking about here, the minister spoke about Africa needing at least $96 billion per year to meet its needs, so that when there is flooding, so that when there is climate change that takes place similar to KwaZulu-Natal, we do not find ourselves having to rebuild all the time. Resilient roads, resilient infrastructure. The Asian region is the most impacted in the world. For Africa, what lessons can we learn? What lessons can our leaders learn from what you have experienced in Asia, as we are also now in Africa starting to experience such changes in climate that today are impacting on ordinary people's lives?
There are really a few broad lessons that I think Asia can share with Africa. Number one, Asia has undergone massive urbanization and industrialization over the past few decades. So this has uplifted the livelihoods of many people. But don't forget, it has also left behind some legacy issues like pollution. So Asia has some of the worst polluted cities in terms of air quality, water quality, and so forth. Right? Nowadays, we are trying to clean up these things. Infrastructure locks in effects for 20, 30 years. So if we can get it right in Africa, build green infrastructure from the onset, I think we can avoid a lot of these issues that we face in Asia that we're now beginning to realize and beginning to clean up. Number two, one of the interesting aspects of Asia is that the development has really, the digital economy, digital-enabled infrastructure has really developed very, very quickly in Asia, in China particularly, but also across Asia. Let me give an example. In Indonesia, we now have a project using satellites to provide broadband connectivity to very remote villages. I think some of these lessons can be hugely applicable to Africa as well, to bring some of these new infrastructure, digitally enabled hospitals, schools, and so on, to assist Africa's development. That's number two. Finally, I would like to say something. Asia also, many Asian countries in the development history are very successful in domestic capital mobilization and also using financial instruments, using the development banks. Today's topic is about public development banks. I think some of these institutional lessons or software can also be used in Africa. So AIB stands ready to work with the national banks, to work with the private sector banks, to work with the public sector development banks in Asia, in Africa, and to bring about infrastructure development finance to the region.
JP, thank you very much for your time. Big lessons there, Michelle, for African leaders who are gathered here for the G20 and the Finance in Common Summit about how Asia, that region, is actually combating climate change. For them, it's quite different when it comes to the air pollution. For us, it's issues of flooding, such as the one we are seeing in KwaZulu-Natal, and as we heard from the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, earlier, the biggest need in terms of climate finance is here on the African continent. But African countries continue to get the raw end of the stick when it comes to climate finance and funding, because there's a risk premium. We pay more in interest for each funding because we are considered risky. But there are lessons to be learned from regions such as Asia, who are here at the biggest gathering of climate finance investment bankers to find solutions to the issues that we are seeing in the regions such as KwaZulu-Natal. Back to you in studio, Michelle.